Welcome to Crossing the Chasm. I'm delighted today to be joined by Ellen Kahler. Ellen became the executive director of the Vermont Sustainable Jobs Fund, VSJF, in late 2005. The VSJF nurtures the economic prosperity, ecological health, and social connectivity of people, businesses, organizations, and communities in Vermont for the benefit and well-being of all who live there by providing business assistance, value chain facilitation, network development, and strategic planning in agriculture and food systems, forest products, waste management, renewable energy, and environmental technology sectors. Prior to joining the VSJF, Ellen was the executive director of the Peace and Justice Center in Burlington. She is a graduate of Bucknell University with a Bachelor of Arts in Political Science and from the Kennedy School of Government at Harvard University with a Master's of Public Administration. Ellen currently serves on the boards of the Working Lands Enterprise Fund, the Vermont Workforce Development Board, Energy Action Network, and the University of Vermont Cal's Board of Advisors. She also currently serves on the Governor's Commission on the Future of Vermont Agriculture. As you can tell by that overview, she has a lot of experience. She has a lot to say. She is really authoritative and well-versed on all these issues. She's got a broad background. I chose to focus today on her work and expertise in agriculture, and I learned a lot. I really appreciated talking with her. I hope you enjoy the conversation. Thanks for listening. Ellen Kahler, welcome to Crossing the Chasm.
Thank you so much. I'm really happy to be here.
I appreciate you making the time. I'm looking forward to talking with you. And to begin, I'd love to just start with a question about the podcast name and so forth, which is, how do you see the chasm or chasms in society as they relate to the work you're doing around food and food systems?
Sure. Great question. Well, really, every single person on this planet needs to be able to eat in order to live. So the extent to which we have such incredible poverty globally in so many developing countries, but even here in the United States, supposedly the richest country on earth, to have 9-10% of the population being food insecure, and then if you add in the demographics of race, you have folks in Black, Asian, Indigenous, Hispanic households that can have food insecurity upwards of almost 20% of the households, which means that there's a lot of kids living in households that are food insecure, which means that when people are food insecure, it produces a lot of physical anxiety because you're hungry all the time. It makes it harder to concentrate if you're a child in school or if you're an adult at work. And it leads, and then that lack of nutrition because of a lack of calories or a lack of nutritious calories means that you're more prone to health challenges and complications to one's health. It can also lead to a reduction in your longevity, your expected life on this planet. So it has a lot of implications that we need to have. Our societal norm should be that everybody has the right to sufficient quantities to work nutritious, healthy, fresh food so that they can live their full life. And they need to have that accessible to them. They needed to have it available to them. They need to have it be culturally appropriate to them so that it's not just all one type of food, but that there's a diversity and a mix of food available to everybody. And people should be able to afford it. And if they can't afford it because of other issues going on in terms of not having enough income, for instance, if they're working or if they're not able to work, then society has an obligation, I think, to ensure that everybody has enough food. And we do that through public policy, through food stamps, for instance, SNAP benefits, and other public resources that are made available. Because the bottom line is they're all human beings, and all human beings need to be able to eat.
So you're making an important point here that food is a requirement, but not everybody's getting it. I want to ask a very broad question about why that is, and that's beyond the scope of this. And we could have a whole podcast just on that. But I'm curious, just if you step back and sort of think about the food landscape, why is it that in such a wealthy country, why are people insecure, and what's wrong with our food system in general from your point of view?
Well, that's a big, big question, a lot of components to it, right? One is the social inequality of in our advanced capitalist society, where we have such incredible income disparity, and you have so many people who, even despite work, are unable to pay their bills and meet their most basic needs, one of which is food. And then you have a number of people in society that, for any number of reasons, they may have a disability, they may be older, they may have fixed income, they may be children, whatever it is, that they're just not able to access enough food. And they could also be living in what's known as food deserts, right? There are lots of people who tend to be in income tracts, census tracts, living in areas with a high degree of poverty. And when you look around at the stores that are available for these folks that live in these communities to access food, it can be really challenging. Either they don't have reliable transportation to physically get to where the food is located, or in some cases, the stores in their areas don't really sell much, if any, fresh food. So, for instance, one of the things that we found across New England, for instance, in the 6 New England states, is there's about 914 Dollar General and dollar value stores. Now, those stores do not sell fresh food. They sell typically ultra processed, high caloric, often very unhealthy shelf stable food. They might sell milk and maybe eggs, but there's like no produce. There's no fruits or vegetables, right? And so these are the stores that are in neighborhoods where people live, and thus they don't even have the ability to purchase healthy food if they have the income to be able to do so. So there is, and some of the reasons for that is very historic in terms of redlining practices in our public policy and urban renewal that started back in the 50s and 60s. Structural racism is also a big factor here for people's ability to access the kinds of food that is healthy, nutritious, and supports them being healthy.
So I'm really delighted that you're bringing up those questions, because a lot of people would just say, either this is just people need to figure out how to get food, to get access to it, to get a job and have money, or it's just a matter of supply and demand. If enough people want good quality food, then the market will sort of provide that. You're taking a different perspective on that. How would you respond to somebody who just used those arguments for how we should deal with our food system?
Well, part of the other structural challenge is that since the really for sure the 1970s, we have had what is commonly known in this country as having a cheap food policy, meaning that it used to be back at the turn of into the early 1900s, people were spending upwards of a third of their income on food, and that meant then there was much fewer dollars available for other types of expenses. So as society progressed and there's more technology and time-saving things and things like refrigerators and microwaves and time-saving appliances, it meant that people were not as tied to having to spend all of their available funds on acquiring food, which often meant they were raising it. They had big gardens in the back and they were putting food by, or they were had chickens in their backyard, and that was their main source of protein for them. So as society progressed all through the 1900s, you had this massive migration happening from rural to urban communities. So then people didn't have the ability to grow their own food, and so you needed the ability of these folks who were then going to be entering into more industrial or other types of non-farm related work to have the ability to get food, since they weren't providing it for themselves. And so in order to pay for that, it was beneficial to think about having food costs as a percentage of your total available dollars to spend on whatever you needed for your life, to be as low as possible, to bring it down from, say, 30% to, say, 10 or 12%, because then you had more money from your work, your wages, to put towards other types of expenses. So we had this cheap food policy, but in the process of doing so, the only way that would work out from a financial standpoint for the producers were for producers to get larger and larger. So what we saw was the USDA secretary at the time in the 70s saying it's about getting big or get out. That was the basic notion in terms of commercial agriculture, industrial agriculture, is that you had to get bigger and bigger. And so we went from having hundreds of thousands of family farms to, I actually don't know what the total number is here across the United States right now, but many fewer family farms. So the nature of farming drastically changed. It also changed in terms of mechanization. It, of course, changed with the introduction of genetically modified seeds. And what we've seen over the last 50 years is a massive consolidation in the production of food. It is now less than 2% of the population is actually producing the food in our country, when it used to be a much, much bigger percentage. And so what we've then also seen in parallel is not just food production being consolidated into fewer and fewer farms, but oftentimes the actual raw commodities are owned by large multinational corporations who contract with farmers to actually grow specifically for them at a certain spec. This has happened in livestock as well. And then, of course, you have what's been happening the last 50 years is a consolidation in the processing of food, in the manufacturing of food, in the distribution of food, and then the grocery sale of food. So all along the way, we have had fewer and fewer very large corporations owning these components, these parts of the food system, which has put downward price pressure on farmers. And while on some level it has kept food prices relatively stable and low, the basic economics is that you have to find all sorts of ways to make the production of that food more and more efficient, which often leads to lower and lower quality of food. And that's when you start then getting into things that are like high caloric, ultra processed, lots of sugar, lots of salt, lots of fat, as a way of filling up bellies so they're not hungry, but not actually providing the nutrition that the human body requires.
What strikes me is you said something earlier about how this has really shifted over time and people live differently and eat differently now. And I'm not asking you to speak for all Americans, but can you speak a little bit about how this has affected people's perceptions of food?
I don't want to overgeneralize, right? But the reality is that we are spending a smaller percentage of our annual spending on our lives, like food, transportation, housing, etc. We're spending a smaller percentage on food. So in 2021, for instance, the average American, this is across all types of consumers, was about 12.4% was spent on food. 33% was on housing, 16% was on transportation, for instance, 5% on entertainment, 1.2% on personal care products, just as a point of reference, right? So we're spending less of our total available annual spending on food than what we did, say, 50 years ago. And that meant that we've been able to buy other things. So then the question becomes how distant are people from understanding what goes into making the food, producing the food that they eat, right? So as we've gone from, I don't know what it was back in the 1930s, but like probably 50, 60% of the population still involved in some kind of agricultural practices, or at least living rurally and being able to understand where food comes from. So now 2% being farmers. It means that those of us who live in suburbs and in cities are much farther afield from understanding how food is produced, how it is moved, where does it land, how is it marketed, how is it sold. And so as a result, I think generally speaking, we don't tend to value it as much because we don't have that personal connection to it as much. Now, that's not across the board, because there's an awful lot of people in the country who do, in fact, have a very strong connection to food, and it's from a quality standpoint, who really do care about where their food comes from, who's producing it, under what conditions, to what extent are people who are producing the food earning enough for themselves to afford to eat enough, right? There's an awful lot of farmers who are food insecure as well, because when you're selling into a generic sort of commodity marketplace, you're a price taker and not a price maker. And that's why the rise of farmers markets and CSAs and farm-to-table restaurants and local food cooperatives, those are places where people tend to still maintain or newly acquired appreciation for fresh, quality food, where it comes from. They meet farmers, they understand them, they learn about and understand where does food come from, what goes into producing it, and why that matters. And so, what I know best is Vermont, and the next best is New England. So I really shouldn't be commenting too much on the whole country, but because what we're trying to do here in New England is to get to a point where 30% of what we produce in the region is also consumed in the region. And we've set a target of 30% by 2030. So the notion here is to have a more robust regional food system across the 6 states that make up New England, so that we are more food secure as a population, so that we can better weather climate events, natural disasters caused by climate change, pandemics, whatever it is, that we have more control over the actual supply of our food supply. That's what we're aiming for here in New England, that I think is unique and different. Not aware of other parts of the country that are really taking that multi-state, sort of a regionally defined, geographically defined part of the country to really try to move the needle on a more regional food system being developed.
Yeah, and I want to get to that in a minute, because I think you all are at the forefront of having this really ambitious plan. I mean, just getting back to your earlier points, it is interesting. I've noted that there's more and more people watching cooking shows than ever, and fewer people actually cooking food, which it speaks to this relationship we have with food. And you mentioned that there are more farmers markets and farm to table and so forth. I guess I'm wondering, because you also mentioned earlier sort of the racialized element in the history of class and redlining, there are some people who argue this whole movement is white, affluent, just for the well-to-do. How do you see it?
Well, I think there's an element of that is true. Not that it should be, though, right? This is, as I said at the outset, everybody, no matter what your demographic situation is, no matter your race, your age, your gender, your income level, you should be able to have access to the type of food that you want. And I think one of the structural reasons for why this has tended to be a lot of white, more affluent people becoming more engaged in a local food system is, one, they have just greater overall capacity because they're not necessarily having 2 or 3 jobs to make ends meet. So they have more time. It takes more time to go to the farmer's market or to go to a farm down the road to pick up your CSA share rather than going to the local grocery store around the corner, right? There is a time element here. It is the case that depending on whether certain foods are in season or not, local food can be perceived and in some cases is more expensive than what you might get in a large national chain supermarket. But that's in part because the local food is actually priced at what it costs to actually produce it, rather than in the case of a lot of these larger farms. If you're a large farm, you're covering your fixed costs over a much larger sales, a much larger volume, right? When you're a smaller farm, which tends to be the ones that are doing farmers markets, you still have a lot of fixed costs, but your overall volume of product to be sold is less, and so the actual unit cost of that food is going to be higher. And then add into that in the Northeast, for instance, with our climate that we're not year-round growers in most cases. There's season extension happening, but and some indoor growing happening. But generally, we have a defined growing season. And so part of it is that. The other, of course, very important structural problem that we have yet to face as a nation is the fact that most farmers of color have had the inability to get the loans and the support and the access to land to actually be farmers. There's a lot of people of color in the country that want to be farming that cannot access land at an affordable price, nor can they get the loans, again, because of the structural way in which we have excluded people of color from accessing capital in this country. That is something that needs to get addressed big time. And it's starting to happen in pockets in different places. There is a Southern Rural Cooperative that's primarily African Americans in the South that have a cooperative, and they're really doing an amazing job of strengthening their ability to be successful farmers. Here in New England, there is a New England Farmers of Color land trust that has been developed, and they've been doing a lot to help young, new and beginning people of color, BIPOC farmers to get onto land so that they can actually enter into the marketplace and that they can can feed their community in and around them. So there's a lot of those issues that you can't just isolate it and say, well, this is primarily a fad of wealthy white people. It may have started a little bit like that, but it can't continue, and it's not ultimately what we're striving to create in an alternative food system that is much more equitable, racially just, and really truly meets the needs of all.
Thank you so much. That is a really nice overview, and you've set the stage really well. I want to pick up on that and just start shifting a bit. And I'd love to hear, can you just give us a sense of agriculture in Vermont and New England? It seems to me that it's a relatively rural area. There's lots of good farming. Can you just give us a sense and paint us a picture?
Yeah, sure. Generally speaking, in terms of the size of the farms in New England, compared to, say, the Midwest or the Central Valley, California, we are small. We have small farms. even our largest farms in New England would probably be considered small in comparison to the Midwest and the Central Valley of California. So it is a totally different scale, and therefore has different needs in terms of capital, has different challenges in terms of accessing the market, which tends to be dominated by the largest farms and multinationals in the country. The cost of per acre of land in New England tends to be a lot higher, so it makes it harder for new and beginning farmers that don't come from farm families and thus are maybe inheriting the family farm. It's harder for folks who haven't grown up in it to get into it. The capital costs, the upfront capital costs, are can be quite a big hurdle. So we tend to be in Vermont. We are dominated by the dairy industry. We have dairy represents about 65% of all of the agricultural sales. Interestingly, while Americans in general are drinking less fluid milk because they have a much wider range of beverages now than they ever did before, the actual consumption of dairy products has increased in large part because of cheese and yogurt and other value-added dairy products has actually increased. So the overall dairy industry has been consuming generally about the same amount of overall what starts off as fluid milk. We have a lot of diversified farms in Vermont, so meaning that they have a wide range of vegetables, and they have sometimes also have smaller livestock like sheep, goats, pigs, chickens, beef cattle, a lot of which is raised on grass or pasture raised, as opposed to we don't have in Vermont, for instance, we don't have any CAFO feedlots like they have out in Colorado and California and places where you see, there's been often in the movies where you have like 20, 30,000 head, basically with standing outside in a mud pit, basically, of their own manure. That is not the type of agriculture we have here in Vermont. We're very grass-based. If there is grain-fed, it's still done so in a way that they're often still on grass for a good chunk of at least the summer months. We have also in Vermont, we have a lot of value-added food manufacturing. Tends to be more specialty foods. We have a lot of maple. We're the largest maple producer in the country in terms of volume. Canada produces more than we do, but we are the largest in the U.S. So it's a real mixture, but it still represents about 10% of our total gross state product is in the food system in some way. And that can be production agriculture, it's distribution, it's food manufacturing, it's sales, restaurants, food service. So we have about 62,000 people in Vermont. We have a population of 640,000 live in Vermont, and 61,000 are involved in the food system. So it's about 10% of the population that's employed in the food system. And again, our gross state sales are about 10%, 11%. So it's still quite a lot of money that is circulated in the food system. It's a big part of our economy, to be sure. It really defines our visual landscape because of being an animal agriculture state primarily. It means that we, what people think of as Vermont, of having fields, open fields, bounded by woods and mountains, sort of the iconic Vermont landscape, is made possible because of, in large part, because of dairy-related agriculture or beef cattle, like large animal agriculture that requires a lot of land because of the need for feed for the non-grass growing times of the year, for hay and corn silage and that kind of thing.
And thank you for painting that picture. That's really nice. And you mentioned earlier sort of the plans and policies that Vermont is moving forward. And I was looking into this a bit and noticed that you have a farm to plate program and some ambitious statewide policies. Can you give us a sense of how the state is approaching this shift in agriculture?
Yeah, so back in 2009, the Vermont legislature passed what is known as the Farm to Plate Investment Program, and then tasked my organization, the Vermont Sustainable Jobs Fund, to create a 10-year strategic plan for strengthening and growing our food system, and had some outcomes that they wanted to see, and then asked us to do that work. So we conducted an 18-month public engagement process, put together the first 10-year strategic plan, launched that in 2011, and then created what's called the Farm to Plate Network of organizations across the state, nonprofits, for-profit, educational institutions, government, capital providers, all together, working together in a collaborative way to try to implement the goals of that plan. And then in 2019, we approached the legislature and said, well, the 10 years is almost up. Do you want us to do it again? And they said yes. So in 2021, we released the second Farm to Plate strategic plan that covers the time period of 2021 to 2030. And we have 15 goals. And one of the markers aspirations that we have, one of the goals we have, is to get to 25% local food consumption by 2030. So I mentioned that the 6-state regional goal target was 30% by 2030. In Vermont, we're looking to try to just have Vermont, our little itty bitty state of 640,000 people, be at 25% by 2030. When we did our last count, we have a local food counts methodology that we conduct every few years, and in 2020, we estimated that we were at about 16% local food consumption. And so we have a bit of a ways to go to get to 25%. So we've got to, really expand the number of people who are spending more of their food dollars, making the choice to spend those food dollars on locally produced foods. Back in 2011, we started at 5%. So we went from 5 to 16% in 10 years. And now we're looking at going from 16 to 25% by 2030.
So you're making progress. And, there's just a lot of people who are super interested in food and food-related issues. I'm wondering if you can give us some specifics about how you actually make interventions in communities and states so that people are eating more local food. What's going on the ground?
You have to hit it from so many different angles. So we have one of the best farm-to-school programs in the country. We're a national leader in getting local food into our K through 12 schools, but then also, importantly, and in some cases more importantly, actually introducing young people to local food and to understanding where it comes from and doing that agricultural literacy work so that they learn about where their food comes from and value it more. So, there's junior Iron Chef competitions, and there's cooking classes and menu development classes and taste testing and stuff with young people, all geared towards better understanding their interest in food and where it comes from, introducing them to local farms and such. We also have a very strong farm to institution movement in this state, as well as the region. And farm to institution means it would include the K through 12 schools, but it also includes colleges and universities. It includes hospitals, prisons, childcare and elder care facilities. Any place where there's a lot of people being fed in different ways. So here in Vermont, for instance, Sodexo, which is a food service management company, has the contracts with most of the college campuses in the state, including University of Vermont, which is the largest. So they're producing about 34,000 meals a day across the state of young people or in college universities settings. And they made a commitment of getting to 25% local food sourcing, but they're just That's what their aspiration is, to just be able to get to that point. They fairly easily got to 20%. It's a little harder to get to 25%, but that's what the commitment is that they've made. And so that involves then helping them to find farmers and food manufacturers who are interested in selling into the Sodexo vendor system, right? You have to be an approved vendor. So we did a lot of work early on with working with Sodexo to make more transparent what it takes to become an approved vendor by Sodexo, so that farmers and food manufacturers could better learn what they needed to do on their side in order to be able to sell to Sodexo. Another approach that we do here in Vermont that we're trying to hopefully get other states in the region to do is to really hone in and focus on what's known as independently owned grocery stores. So the non-big chains, so not Stop and Shop, not Kroger's, but our state-specific food cooperatives and regional grocers like Hannaford's or Star Market, for instance, Market Basket in Massachusetts, for instance. We have Associated Grocers of New England is a distributor of foods that also owns some stores, but they're regionally based. And they have 5 stores that they own in Vermont, for instance, and they've been developing a very strong local food sourcing program. And our food co-ops, they can have 30 to 40% of all the products in their stores are locally sourced products. So you have to hit it from a lot of different angles, right? Because we need to have it so that young people and people at hospitals or in schools, colleges, that they have access to local food, and we can make inroads there because we can develop relationships with the people who are sourcing. They're actually buying the food into their institution. And then we need to have this strategy of getting into independently owned grocery stores, food co-ops, and eventually the larger regional chains with sourcing in more local and regionally produced food. And the consumer can actually play a good role in that they can ask for it. You know, most of us go into a regular grocery store and just assume that what's there is just all there is, and we don't have any ability to influence what is being presented as an option. And that's not actually the case. Consumers don't tend to be organized in groups. And so we don't tend to try to figure out, like, well, how could we put pressure on regional grocery store chains so that all of the fresh produce in our stores, at least half of the year, is coming from local and regionally sourced farms. There's no organized effort to do that. But that's a key thing that we should be thinking about.
So you've hit on 2 things that are quite important. You started this talk by really laying out a lot of the problems and barriers and challenges. And you've also laid out the sort of pathway forward that we need to have people more engaged and demanding different kinds of things. Can you speak a little bit about how you all are trying to engage the public to try to move this program forward so that there is more local food that's available?
A few years ago, for about 4 years, we ran what we called Rooted in Vermont, which was actually a consumer awareness campaign to basically celebrate all of the ways that Vermonters are already engaged in the local food system. And that can include people who hunt and fish and have gardens and put food by, as well as people that purchase from their local farm stand or have a CSA membership or shop at a local food co-op, or, make sure that when they go to restaurants that they're really looking for those products on the menu that where it's stated on the menu where that food, what farm that food is coming from. Right. So we wanted to celebrate that. We did that for about 4 years, and we had quite a bit of good impact of just raising awareness and celebrating people doing local food, in essence. Right now, our biggest focus area is actually on trying to work with farmers who maybe mostly sell direct to consumers, like through farmers markets and CSAs, who actually are realizing that they would like to learn how to sell into wholesale markets, to be picked up by a distributor and sold into grocery stores, for instance, or who are interested in learning how to do direct store delivery, a DSD it's called. So some of them are large enough where they might have a box truck and they can do their own shipping, distribution of their products from their farm direct to a store, for instance, they develop a relationship with. In some cases, we're doing a lot of work with what are called food hubs, which are typically very values-based, smaller distributors who are, many of whom are nonprofit organizations, actually, who specialize and came about because of the number of very small producers that were not able to move their food from point A to point B because the larger distributors weren't willing to come to their farm and, pick up a couple of cases of a vegetable as opposed to several pallets worth of vegetables. So these food hubs have played an important role in making the marketplace more accessible to smaller producers because they're willing to do that last mile pickup, and they're specializing in selling into schools or selling into hospitals or places where some of the larger distributors aren't providing the option of fresh local food. They're only, willing to offer commodity products from shipped all the way across the country, for instance. So there's a lot of that happening. And then a lot of it is also, again, as I mentioned, working with these independently owned grocery stores to try to develop a local food program where they're sourcing in more local and then learning how to merchandise that food so that then the consumer knows it's there, right? It's one thing to have it displayed well, but if you don't have signage that says, hey, these are local strawberries from down the road, or here's a picture of the farm that these green beans came from, or the sweet corn came from, the store owners themselves can be doing a lot more to help educate consumers and drive consumers to wanting that local food if they actually bring it into their stores. And so we do a lot of work with grocers around learning how to merchandise and do taste tests and develop relationships with and sort of soft contracts with local farmers, for instance. So all of those things are going on. And then we're also really working hard to expand the infrastructure of, meat processing facilities, because we have a lot of small livestock producers, and it can be really challenging to get their animals in for processing, to be harvested and then packaged and sold, because there's not enough. There's like a really long waiting list. So some of this is expanding meat processing facilities, expanding their capacity. It's also figuring out additional warehousing and more efficient truck routes for distribution. All of these kinds of things. You have to hit it at every level. There's no one thing that's going to fix the current food system. And so you have to hit it from so many different angles. And that's the power of working in a networked way, is that no one organization can do all of that. But you have dozens and dozens and dozens of organizations doing it together in a collaborative way, each using their expertise and their abilities. You can pull off a lot more faster that way.
So I feel like you're doing all kinds of things and being quite modest. When I was looking into this program, I was looking, and you all are at the forefront of a lot what's going on. And so there are a lot of people thinking about what you all are doing and trying to emulate it. What thoughts do you have for people in other areas of the country on what has worked and what hasn't, given your experience?
It's pretty straightforward. Have a plan that has a lot of stakeholder engagement to create, so that there's widespread ownership of that plan, and people get excited and inspired to want to work together to create something different and have the kind of food system that many of us really want to have, not what we currently have. It's been handed down by large multinational industrial agriculture businesses. And then it's forming a network of these organizations and partners to be able to collaboratively work on the goals of the plan and the key leverage points for change that have been identified through a robust planning process. Then you need to have what's called continuous communication. It's having so much of what holds and keeps the existing food system in place is a lack of transparency and a lack of smaller producers understanding, in quotes, sort of the rules of the marketplace. There's a lot of hidden costs, hidden fees, slotting fees, discounting that happens where smaller producers they really struggle to be able to sell into grocery store chains because the price point that those grocery store chains are willing to pay them is below their cost of production. But a lot of farmers might not know all of the different ways in which these larger grocery chains tack on all these different fees and discounts and things that actually reduce what they actually receive for the food that they're producing. And so some of it is, like in the example of Sodexo that I gave you, some of it was, we brought producers together with the leadership of Sodexo in our New England region to have a very frank conversation about how does it work? What does the vendor contracting process actually look like? And it was majorly eye-opening for so many of us because we had no idea. And simple rules like you can't just show up at the back of the store on your timetable as the producer and expect that somebody's going to be there at the loading dock to take your food and pay you on the spot. There's certain times of the day and there's certain quantities and there's certain turnaround times when you can expect to be paid for things. So there's just these rules of the marketplace that have been very non-transparent to a lot of people. People just don't know about it. So part of it, the answer is here on this continuous communication is as much as possible democratizing the information. Information is power. And when so few corporations hold the knowledge of the rules of the game, and the vast majority of folks that are producing food don't know what the rules of the game is, they're going to lose every time. Right? So a lot of what we do is uncover what's really going on and then share that widely so that more and more people understand it so that they can then make adjustments to their own businesses and do what they need to do in order to try to succeed in the marketplace. So that's three. Another one that's key is around data. And if you spend some time on our website, vtfarmtoplate.com, you'll see that there's a lot of data. And we do that, again, to democratize information, but also it allows us to show that progress is being made. When you think about it, the average person, you don't want to be part of something that's like a losing proposition. You want to be part of something that's being successful. So if we are making progress, we want to tell people about that so that they can see that they're part of something bigger than just themselves, and it's something that is making improvements and things are getting better. And that's a part of the sort of the recipe of what we're doing. And then finally, it's this notion of what we call what's known as a backbone organization. And that's what my organization does for our food system and the farm to plate effort, which, as I said, is a multi-organizational initiative. We serve as kind of the back shop, the administrative, thought leader, facilitative organization that helps to be the glue that allows everything to happen easier, more efficiently, faster. We're the dot connectors and the weavers that help to help everybody work together better so that we can collectively go farther faster. And those are the key components. It's actually a documented framework called the Collective Impact Framework, and we were early adopters of that framework back in 2011, and it has really served us well, and we promote it to others. When other people call us, we say, well, you should really take a look at this framework and build what you want to do around that, because it really does work.
Thank you for that. That was really interesting. I appreciate the insights on how you all as an organization are moving that forward and collectively. That's fantastic. I want to end with three questions that are more personal. But before we get to that, one last substantive question, which is, you made a very powerful argument that our food system is not working and that there are benefits to individuals if they have a healthier diet. You also made an argument that if we have a better food system, that producers will be better off. I'm wondering if you can speak to the social element. What kind of argument would you make to suggest that a different kind of food system that meets people's health needs and producers' needs also has a social impact? How does it affect communities?
Well, it has to do with, in economic terms, what's known as the multiplier effect. When you keep your dollars more local, meaning that you're buying food from your neighbor down the road, those dollars stay in your community and circulate and have a much bigger impact than, for instance, if you're in Vermont and you're buying a head of lettuce or some hamburger meat that's coming from 3,000 miles across the country. Those dollars are leaving the area and going to where it was produced in California or wherever. So part of it is being connected to community and having thriving rural communities where food is produced. The people who are producing it are well supported and have good livelihoods. And quite frankly, food has always been a uniter. You think about the quintessential being around the kitchen table or inviting people over for a potluck or having a community celebration. We still have a lot of that happening in Vermont. We have granges where there's community suppers. There's fire departments that have chicken barbecues happening throughout the summer as a fundraiser, but it brings people together. And food is that, because we all have to eat, food is a uniter, and bringing people together across the dinner table, across the picnic table, across, in a big festival, for instance. There's a lot of food festivals, a lot of beer festivals. It creates that sense of community and connection and sort of love of that experience, and so that's a big part of it as well. It's the economic, it's the environmental issues connected to our food system, wanting to do it in a more production in a more regenerative way, but then also the distributive way of being able to ensure that everybody is both able to access the food, and then if you're producing the food, you're earning enough for what you're producing, so you're not getting prices that are below the cost of your production. And it's something we need to all learn about more and unpack how we got here, right? I mean, I think what's important to know is, like, we didn't just get to our current food system overnight. It has happened over the last 50 years in particular, which means that it's going to take time to shift and change and become more of what we want it to be in this next 50-year period. And that's going to involve a lot more people being involved in the food system, people understanding where their food comes from, making values choices about the food that they purchase or acquire or grow, and making sure that everybody has access to it. That everybody needs to be able to eat.
Yeah, that's really well said. Thank you so much for those perspectives. I really appreciate that. And I just want to end with some quick couple of personal questions for you. I'm wondering, what do you see in society that gives you inspiration and energy, either in the food system or beyond?
I think really community and a sense that we can affect change by working together. And, in the food system, people here in Vermont anyways, like, you go to a big gathering of food system planners and doers, for instance, and it's a very happy group of people because they're passionate about food and really, they have been turned on to, like, what does a real, fresh, homegrown or locally grown tomato taste like? That's in season as compared to something that you get in a large chain supermarket that was picked basically green and ripened so sort of on the truck across the country that then lands in in a bin that is going to then is something that's going to maybe last on the shelf for several weeks, but by the time it gets to your salad, for instance, it tastes like cardboard, you know. The same thing with like fresh local strawberries or fresh local blueberries or apples in season, or grass-fed hamburger meat as compared to a feedlot in California meat. I mean, when you do side-by-side taste tests, it's really hard not to taste the difference. I was actually last Saturday, we've been part of a project trying to help dairy farmers to do some genetic crossing between Holstein dairy cows and beef cattle as a way of increasing the premium price that they can get for the animals once they no longer are dairy animals and become meat for steak and hamburgers. And we had a little taste test at one of the farms that's participating in the pilot, and they had three different types. They had a traditional piece of steak, all the same cuts, but a traditional steak from an animal that was raised someplace unknown, your sort of traditional supermarket commodity type steak, and then a mixed breed of Wagyu and usually a Holstein that was more locally raised, and then 100% Wagyu beef. And you literally could taste the difference. The same cut, it's like a New York strip or whatever in all three cases. But if you do side-by-side taste tests, you can really, really, truly know the difference. And people who get hooked on cooking, like we did, a lot of people got really hooked on cooking, as you said, during the pandemic. And they started cooking for themselves again, and they started like slowing down and really tasting their food and being proud of the fact that they were learning how to make sourdough bread or whatever they were doing, or getting inspired by the Great British Bake Off, for instance, and learning how to make fresh things for themselves. Like, there is a transformation that can happen, and it inspires people to want to learn more. It inspires people to want to eat better and share more of food with their friends and neighbors and such. Grow an extra row for people who are economically struggling, for instance. It really helps, I think, connect people to community more, which is, I think, really in this day and age, a lot of what people are feeling has been missing in their lives is that connection to people in their community.
Thank you so much for sharing that. Absolutely. Have you read or seen or listened to anything recently that really changed your view or made you think differently about the work you do?
Not really. Sophie Howe, who was the first commissioner of the Wellbeing of Future Generations Commission in the country of Wales, was just in Vermont for a couple of days, and we introduced her to some legislators and a bunch of students at the University of Vermont. And she was talking about sharing what they've been doing over in Wales with really planning their economy and their community's society around a much longer term view about the well-being of future generations. And, listening to Sophie give her talk a couple of times, I think it didn't change my view. It just made it much, it just redoubled my commitment to be working in the way in which we're working for the things that we're working for. Like it really helped strengthen my resolve, so to speak, that we're really onto something here. It's really what people want. It's what the planet needs. It is the right way to be considering how we take care of each other and really move from since the 80s with Ronald Reagan, the me generations, the me economy to a we economy, which is really what we need. And you think about the number of the new statistics out about eco-anxiety and about loneliness levels and our opioid epidemics, so many people struggling and feeling despair and mental health crises in our communities. A lot of that is because we've lost connection with each other. We've lost connection with the earth. And I think any work that is leading to helping people to reconnect with themselves, reconnect with others, and reconnect with the planet is the right work to be doing at this day and age. And so it's more what I gravitate towards is finding people who are doing those kinds of things, because that's sort of the added fuel to the inspiration that I already experienced.
Oh, that's fantastic. And then lastly, you're doing a lot of work. It's a lot of challenges and so forth. I'm wondering what you do in your life that gives you a sense of peace and joy.
Meditation, actually. I back in 2009, I became very active in learning, studying, and practicing Buddhism, and that has really helped me to stay grounded and focused and nourished my soul and my being, and informs a lot of what I do and how I do what I do in a day-to-day way.
Well, thank you so much for that. And thank you so much for coming onto the show. It's been a pleasure talking with you.
Thank you so much for having me. I really appreciated it.
It is such a treat speaking to people who really have vast knowledge and can speak so clearly and effectively as Ellen can. I really loved the presentation she gave, the conversation, the insights. I learned a lot. I hope you all enjoyed the conversation as much as I did. As always, I want to thank Dan Phillips and Cody Bayless, the executive producers of Crossing the Chasm, and Anodyne Diversion for supplying the music. And as always, I want to thank you all for listening. Thanks so much for tuning in. I hope you enjoyed the show, and I hope you can join us again on Crossing the Chasm.